Hey everybody, it's Noon here. I'm here with a video about Freud. This is mainly aimed at people in a class that I'm studying. I'm studying counseling at the moment. I've just started. And there's been, a reasonable amount of material about Freud and psychoanalysis. And I think that to some extent it's been misrepresented in my class. Maybe that's not entirely fair, because we're not studying psychoanalysis, we're studying, as I said, counseling and psychotherapy. And the way that Freud is understood in those fields is kind of its own thing. But I wanted to talk a bit about my version of Freud, frankly. Freud is a complicated and divisive figure, and he, invented psychoanalysis. And there are many different types of psychoanalysis. So here are just some of his disciples. So there's Jung, Anna Freud, Alfred Adler, and Melanie Klein. And so these people represent four basically totally different understandings of what Freud was working on and what psychoanalysis is about. And I think if you asked a Kleinian or an Adlerian, or definitely a Jungian, they would give very different ideas about what Freud was talking about than what I'm going to say, because I am a Lacanian. I'm interested in the work of Jacques Lacan, who's this guy, who's a French psychoanalyst. I'm not going to be talking about Lacan very much directly, but I think I just want to sort of note right up top that I'm coming at this from a particular angle. It's not what everyone's going to think. And I mean, that's kind of why I'm doing the video, right? Is that I've been hearing some different versions of Freud, some different versions of what psychoanalysis is, and I want to present my version of it. That said, this is definitely going to influence how I talk about what Freud was doing, and I just wanted to acknowledge that up front, that I'm not sort of some enlightened Freudian who has no other influences, and I particularly hang my hat with Jacques Lacan. So, first off, Freud was a medical doctor. He started, doing neurological work, so nerve problems. He was a nerve doctor, which is obviously a slightly outdated concept. We talk about neurology now, and he was particularly working on hysteria, which again is basically an outdated diagnosis. It's still used in Lacanian analysis, but it obviously has a lot of connotations, especially about sexism, which I think those are fair critiques to make, to be clear. That's the other thing I wanted to say, is that, I'm not trying to say Freud was perfect. I definitely don't think Lacan was perfect. I think there's a lot to criticize about both of them, especially on a personal level. But theoretically, I think that they contributed a lot. Well, I'm talking about Freud. I think Freud contributed a lot. And a lot of the things that were correct were so correct that they are now the sea that we swim in. The whole field of counseling and psychotherapy comes from Freud's work. The idea that talking about your feelings might help you in some way. That was something that Freud basically invented the idea of, which seems, crazy. But it's true. And when we dismiss Freud's work as, quackery or whatever, I think there's a lot of baby being thrown out with bathwater. So hysteria was a diagnosis that basically meant acting kind of weird, and in particular, women acting kind of weird. And as you can see, in this situation, there's a bunch of men, doctors, who are studying under this guy in the middle here, Charcot, who was a physician who did a lot of work that's still entirely relevant. I think he worked a lot on multiple sclerosis, and a lot of his diagnostic and so on work is still completely valid and accepted in the medical community today, though, I'm not an expert on that. Not that I'm an expert on any of this, but I'm certainly not in the medical stuff. But he worked a lot in hysteria. He did a lot of these demonstrations where he'd get women to come up and, act weird. So hysteria could involve all sorts of things, tics, paralysis, fainting, not wanting to have sex, wanting to have sex, anorexia, other eating disorders, being angry, sleeping too much, not sleeping enough. Basically just like any problem that women had that wasn't obviously diagnosable as a physical ailment. And Freud did a lot of work with hysterical patients, and through that he invented his method of psychoanalysis, where basically he was interested in the unconscious. the unconscious being the parts of ourselves that we don't understand, that we don't know about. I'll just also note, people often flit between using the words unconscious and subconscious, and I'd just like to really emphasize that Freud was interested in the unconscious. Subconscious is a vague term, and I think is kind of used to get away from the discomfort of the idea of the unconscious. It's a small thing, it's just a word, it doesn't really matter all that much, but subconscious implies like, oh, we could get access to that somehow, whereas unconscious is this unknowable thing that's inside us. Freud said that I can't remember the exact quote, but Darwin discovered that man was not the center of creation, and I've discovered that he's not even the master of his own home, or something along those lines. It's a snappier quote than that. There's someone else in it as well. I think it was Copernicus discovered the Earth is not at the center of the universe. Darwin discovered that man is not the center of creation, and I have discovered that he is not even the master of his own house, meaning that there's stuff controlling what we do that we don't know about. And these hysterical women, again, mainly women, he treated plenty of men as well. Not trying to get into a gender thing, but that's how Freud saw it. And they didn't know what was going on for them. They didn't know why they had nervous coughs. They didn't know why they had trouble getting up in the morning. They didn't know why they were afraid of horses. They didn't know, all sorts of things. They were doing these things and they weren't sure why. And I think that really reflects what a lot of people go to therapy for. They're like, I'm unhappy and I'm not sure why. Again, in the world of counseling, a lot of it is quite specific stuff, right? There's people experiencing violence and they need support in that. There's people who have lost someone and they need support with that. Those things, they do know what's going on. But inside all of us, there's a large part of us that we don't know what's going on. And I think even on just a very fundamental level, if you think about, the stuff that you once knew that has gone, things that, what did I eat for breakfast last week? I can't possibly operate with that in my mind. There's stuff that gets shunted away. And Freud talked about libido. This was his idea of kind of a life force. I'm pretty sure he came up with the term libido. I don't know what the etymology of it is. I should have looked it up. But in modern parlance, libido means sex drive, how horny you are. But for Freud, it was something very different. It had some of that connotation, but it was more like vitality. It was your motivation. And, I've used this picture of Goku doing a Kamehameha blast because I think that's a really good way of thinking about libido. It's almost like chi or prana or something like that. He meant it less mystically than those things, but I think that there's sort of a close analogy there. And he thought that libido kind of moved around our body. He had the idea of the hydraulic model, meaning that libido is kind of like water. And if we blocked libido from flowing, it would go in a different direction. Like if you put a dam in a river, or a big rock in a river, the water will flow around. The river will change course, but it'll keep flowing. And I think this is connected with the idea of the unconscious in that, if we want something, I want to sleep with someone, for example, is a classic Freudian example. But it would be inappropriate, it's my friend's partner or something like that, it's my teacher, something like that. And I'm just going to shut that down. I'm like, nah, can't think about that. But the libido keeps coursing and it's going to find expression in other ways. I'll come back to that, but I just wanted to introduce this concept of libido, which I think is quite important and was not something that was discussed in my class's version of Freud, and I think is a valuable thing to keep in mind. Libido is connected with this idea of the pleasure principle. So I think this is something that a lot of people who aren't Freudians can kind of feel moderately comfortable with, the pleasure principle. This is the idea that humans seek pleasure. Freud had a particular model for it where it's about the relieving of tension. So tension is displeasure, and pleasure is the relief of tension. So you might think about this, an easy example is hunger. You get more and more hungry. That's a type of tension. Then when you eat, I'm so full, I'm relaxed, I'm going to go have a siesta, Or horniness as well is like another version of that, right? Where you get all kind of heated up and you're like, I'm really turned on. And then you have an orgasm and that tension dissipates. And Freud thought that pleasure was basically like this in all ways. So that was kind of his original operating principle of libido. Libido, pleasure principle, closely connected ideas. But then in, I think it's 1920, after he'd been sort of doing his thing for 20, 30 years, depending on, when you think of it, he published The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900, I think it was, or 1901. And that's kind of when he became Freud. So before that, he'd been working with hysterics and kind of developing his idea of the unconscious. 1900, he sort of, becomes the Freud that we all know and have conflicted feelings about. Starts talking about the pleasure principle, desire, libido, that sort of thing. Keeps working with patients for about 20 years, and then he writes this book, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where he comes up with the idea of what he calls death drive. And he notices this mainly in veterans of war who have what he calls shell shock, or I think it's called war hysteria as well. Again, hysteria, vague term, meaning something like acting weird. I guess you could probably, attach it to anxiety as a modern rough equivalent. But also, there's a lot of stuff about somatic issues in hysteria. That's not super important. I'm not trying to convince you that hysteria is a useful framework for diagnosis or mental health work. But the point is shell shock, which, we would call PTSD now, something like that, where veterans have come back from the war and they're all fucked up. They're having issues. They're having bad dreams, in particular, recurring nightmares where they relive bad events over and over again. And Freud basically thought, if we're governed by the pleasure principle, what's going on in these people's brains that's causing them to relive this suffering? And so he hypothesizes this thing called death drive, which is basically operating against the pleasure principle in some way. And death drive is a very difficult idea that, books have been written on and I can't really cover here. But one way, and again, this is a sort of my understanding of the Lacanian view of the death drive, which Lacan calls it the drive. He takes out the death, which I think is helpful in terms of understanding this idea. The drives basically increase the tension that the pleasure principle resolves. And the drives enjoy, that's a sort of technical term, enjoy, roughly meaning what we mean it, how we use it in colloquial language, but with a kind of a gritty, horrible aspect to it, something kind of nasty or dirty. I've heard it glossed as like getting off on. It drives up that tension. And, if you think about this in terms of sex, that kind of makes sense with the use of the word getting off on. Someone might have a kink that doesn't achieve orgasm but gets them more and more turned on. And that's the drive. That's a drive that's kind of increasing the tension. Another way to think of drives is that they're sort of the language of, maybe language is the wrong word, they're the expressions of parts of our bodies that have their own logic. So, there's this idea of an oral fixation, which I'm not really going to go into that at all, but the idea is that our mouth kind of gets off on chewing and sucking, and it does that regardless of how hungry you are. And so that's why people who you might say have an oral fixation smoke or chew gum or want to give oral sex or that kind of thing, is that the mouth has its own drive that's operating kind of independently of anything else. So yes, that's the pleasure principle and drives. And I think for Lacan and Lacanians, the drive is kind of the key to what's going on with people. They say the drive, even though debatably it's a whole lot of drives. Just name a few. The optic drive, or the scopic drive as it's called, the desire to look, of the oral drive to chew and suck, the anal drive to shit, basically, sex drive to have sex. There's all of these different parts of our bodies. The skin has a drive to touch, and there's a drive to talk as well. I think that's quite important for Lacan. But anyway, these things have their own logic that don't necessarily line up with the pleasure principle, and they can cause symptoms. Here's the drive. So I will talk about symptoms a bit more in a minute, but first I wanted to just talk about the idea of the id, ego, and superego. And I think this image here of Crunk from The Emperor's New Groove, Crunk? I haven't seen that movie in ages. Sums up the stereotyped version, where the id is a devil, the superego is an angel, and the ego is this big doofus in the middle trying to make a decision. And if there's one thing that you take out of this video, I'd like it to be, this is a bad stereotype of that arrangement. I also just, as a side note, this is a classic entry-level Freud fact, but in the German he calls them the Es, Ich, and Über-Ich, which literally translated into English are the it, the I, and the over-I. And they were translated into these Latin terms, id, ego, superego, by James Strachey, who was the first translator of Freud into English, because he thought they sounded more technical and medical, and they were trying to reach a medical audience of people who, like Freud, were medical doctors, who might be interested in doing, what we would think of now as mental health treatment. They thought it would have legitimacy to give them Latin terminology. It would sound medical, official, scientific. But I think thinking of it as the I and the it, superego I think is fine, but the I and the it I think are really good words for it. The ego is the part of yourself that you think of as yourself, which isn't to say that it's all conscious. I think that's another misconception, that the ego is conscious and that the it is unconscious, but that's not entirely true. But the it is really a bundle of drives. I've got here this image of the Hydra and Hercules trying to slay the Lenaean Hydra. I'm not sure who the other person in this is. I can't remember that myth very well. I should have looked into it more. But the id is this tangle of competing drives and wants that don't necessarily even cooperate that well. They might be against one another, I love my best friend, but I want to fight him, or that kind of thing. Or my parents, I love my parents, but they make me angry and I want to yell at them. It's not a very sophisticated example, but you get the idea. Or a drive to be really hot and fit and sexy, and another drive to eat cake and lie around all day. Again, not a super sophisticated example, but you get the idea. I want to emphasize that the id is a tangle. It's not clear. And it's being kind of regulated to some extent by the superego. The superego, I don't want to get too into this because it's something that I'm aware that I have some difficulty with, but it compels us to enjoy in particular socially acceptable ways. So it's not opposed to the id necessarily, but it's strict, and it kind of it causes us suffering as well. I think that's another misconception about the angel thing, is that angels are good for you. The superego makes you hate yourself. It thinks it says that your thoughts are as bad as your actions. So when you think, I really want to punch my friend, or whatever, I want to sleep with his partner, the superego says, well, you're a bad person. They're conflicting forces in that way, and the superego to some extent is I think Freud says it's the heir to the Oedipus complex, which we'll talk about Oedipus in a minute, because it's another misconception that I kind of wanted to touch on. But I guess one way of saying that is that the superego takes on the stuff that you think you should feel bad about as a child, something like that. It kind of represents the worst parts of your parents telling you that you're naughty and you're bad and you're inadequate. The ego is in the middle of it all. It is basically a bundle of symptoms. I haven't really talked about symptom too much recently. In this video. Symptom, again, Freud was a medical doctor and he was concerned with symptoms. Early on in those hysterical patients, again, sort of using the word hysteric with a grain of salt, but the hysterical patients, their symptoms were things like paralysis of the arms or a nervous tic where they would cough all the time. Stuff like that were kind of bodily symptoms that make sense when you think of him as a neurologist, basically. But for later analysts, symptoms are things like depression or procrastination or phobias, right? Mental symptoms, behaviors and beliefs and attitudes to the world that don't really make that much sense. And they are what you call a compromise formation, right? Symptoms arise as a compromise between the different parts of your id and your superego and what is kind of possible out there in the world when you encounter difficulties, So I think about, my issues with depression at high school. I hated school. I wanted to yell and scream. I wanted to run away, but I kind of couldn't for various reasons. Part of that was like literally, we were inside a locked, courtyard at school. But also I was like, oh, I can't be naughty. I can't be bad and run away from school. So the compromise that I made was I'm going to completely zone out. I'm not going to pay any attention. I'm going to basically become catatonic in class. And so I lost all emotional affect or, became very upset at times. Those were symptoms that were a compromise, an outlet between these competing forces, these competing drives, the pleasure principle, and sort of the reality of my situation. And then later, even when I got out of those situations, the symptoms stayed there. And they stayed there in my ego. I think that's kind of where I wanted to get with this, is that the ego is a symptom, in a sense. It's a symptom of being a person who can speak, who's embedded in society, who has relationships with other people, who has a body that wants certain things, and a sense of guilt and shame that doesn't want certain things. And so I had this image here of this boiling pot because I think one way that I want to think about it is that the id is the water, which is boiling. The superego is the lid. And, again, angel and devil. Is water boiling a devil? Is a lid an angel? I don't think that's true. I think this, they're just different functional parts of a system. And the ego is the steam. It's kind of hard to catch, It's a bit unclear where it is and what it is, but it's caught between these two forces. And it's full of heat and movement, and it can burn you. Anyway, that's it's just a little bit about symptom formation. This was just, I think this is called In Search of Lost Time. I can't remember exactly. I'm not a painting guy, but this came to mind when I was thinking of symptom formation. I'm not entirely sure why, which is a great demonstration of my unconscious. But I guess there's something here about, the clocks are still kind of working, but they're also kind of fucked up. And I think that's sort of the situation with the ego. It's bent and deformed, but it's still kind of ticking along. Next, I just want to talk a little bit about diagnosis for Freud. The two main diagnoses that he worked with were obsessional neurosis and hysterical neurosis. Neurosis, again, really vague term. It means something like something going wrong in the brain or body, which really shows how unhelpful it is to the modern mind. But basically, I think for Freud, hysteria involved some kind of bodily somatic issue. So again, I was talking about paralysis and tics, whereas obsessional symptoms are more in the realm of language and thought. It's not the same, to be clear, as obsessional compulsive disorder, OCD. Those modern diagnostic categories from the DSM or that kind of thing, they are not the same as the things that they sound like in Freud. I just wanted to make that really clear. But obsessional neurosis might be someone who, for example, gets annoyed in class and makes a long video where they get to talk about it. I think a lot of authors are obsessionals. They kind of express themselves through language. They can't stop worrying about things, but again, it's not literally obsessional in the sense of OCD. And then hysteria, yeah, is more of that kind of bodily end of things. This is definitely the Freudian version, or again, my understanding of the Freudian version. For Lacan, I think these things take on a different connotation. Freud also talked about paranoia, psychosis, and schizophrenia, which were kind of a separate category. And he didn't treat psychotics, psychotic being the umbrella term for those sorts of symptoms and syndromes. But he did write a book about a guy called Judge Schraber, who was, you probably call him a schizophrenic, but he had, major hallucinations and all sorts of things. It's a really interesting case, but that's kind of beyond the scope of this video. I just wanted to mention that, so Freud was mainly working with hysterics and obsessionals, which were both types of neurotics. And then Lacan kind of brings in this these three diagnostic categories: neurotic, psychotic, and perverse. And obsessional and hysterical are both types of neurotic. Anyway, that's... I'll say one more thing about this, which is about negation. So negation is a major theme for Freud. He wrote a paper called On Negation. It's very readable. It's maybe 2 pages long, 3 pages, something like that. It's very short. It's very conversational. And he says that the unconscious doesn't know negation. There's no in the unconscious. He gives the example of someone who, a patient who says, well, I don't know who that person was in my dream, but it wasn't my mother. And Freud says that we can be sure that it was his mother. Because why would you bring it up specifically to say no? The unconscious is saying, it's my mum. And then the somewhere along the line between there and speech, you think, oh no, I don't want that to be my mum. I'll chuck a no in there. But the no is kind of fake. It's a disguise for the earnest remark, that was my mother in the dream. And for Lacan, these 3 different categories have different primary forms of negation. So for neurotics, it's repression. For psychotics, it's foreclosure. And for perversions, for perverts, it's disavowal. That's a whole thing. I'm not going to get into it. That's that's a whole other video at some stage, but it's something that I find quite interesting and cool about Lacanian analysis, and I just wanted to mention it here. This is just another painting that I thought captured something about repression and the unconscious quite nicely. There's this kind of ugly part that we hide away, but it always comes out, and it displaces the mask, the repressed always comes out somewhere. I'll talk a bit more about that towards the end of the video. Next, I wanted to talk about Oedipus. In class, there was some allusion made to Freud thought people wanted to do disgusting things with their parents, which I thought was, there's this classic joke. Freud thought every man wanted to have sex with his mother, but that's disgusting. Freud's mum must be dead for 200 years by now. And I think there's a number of issues here. The first is that, or maybe this is not the most important one, but it's an interesting one, that for Oedipus didn't know that he was having sex with his mother. It's really crucial to the whole point of the story, is that he didn't mean to do it. He didn't want to do it. He didn't want to kill his father. It was a terrible accident. Um, and I think that there's something there. But the other thing is that Freud was making a pop culture reference. Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is a different pop culture reference than the one that I thought. There's an extra slide here. But if you've seen The Great, I think it's on Stan. There's this great line where Peter the Great says, Peter, played by the guy from Skins, says, I'm terrible at actors' names, sorry. He says, someone ought to figure out what goes on between a man and his mother. There'd be money in that. And I think that's kind of really what a good summary of Oedipus is that people have shit with their parents, stuff, there's issues, you love them, you hate them, you take on their characteristics, you resist their characteristics, you learn things from them, whether you want to or not, and you compete for their affection. I think that's really the crucial part of Oedipus, is that, Freud thinks that as a very young child, our primary caregiver, who I'm just going to call the mother, again, there's a whole issue about gender here, but let's just go with the sort of heteronormative family structure, nuclear family structure, just for the sake of ease. You rely on your mother for absolutely everything. You, as a young infant, straight after birth, your mother is your entire world, and I guess on some level you think that you're her entire world. And then as you get a bit older, you think, actually, she wants other stuff. She's in love with my dad. But that's fucked up. I need that love for me. What the hell? And that's basically the whole of the Oedipus complex in a nutshell. I think it's really easy to exaggerate it to be like, I literally want to have sex with my mom and I literally want to murder my father. No, that's not it. It's, I need a lot from my mom, and I see that my dad is intervening in some way. Just as an aside, I think also, from what I've heard from practicing analysts, people do have experiences where they really hate their dad, and I think that is that's all part of it as well. Or little kids saying things like, when I grow up, I'm going to marry my mummy. If you read Freud's case history of little Hans, which I wouldn't if I were you, if unless you're really interested, but even then I wouldn't start with the case histories. They tend to be really dry, but that's a side note. But little Hans has a bunch of stuff like, I want to sleep in the bed with my mum and I want dad to go away forever. Things like that. It's not a direct quote, but that kind of thing. So, these things do happen. It's not as far-fetched as we might feel it should be, or as we would be comfortable imagining. But anyway, this was the pop culture thing that I was going to say. Is for Freud, Oedipus Rex was a play that he liked and thought people would know about, and was a handy name to attach to this situation that he'd noticed. And I think that would be kind of like calling toxic masculinity Ron Swanson disease or something. The Ron Swanson complex. So there's Ron Swanson from Parks and Recreation. It's a pretty good show. He is a gruff man who loves alcohol and shooting guns and doesn't like talking at all, let alone about feelings. And if that's where we left it, then sure, Ron Swanson disease might be a great name for toxic masculinity. But he's also a very caring father and partner. He understands the people around him and looks after them. He respects the women in his life and goes out of his way to let them excel. He encourages people to follow the paths in life that are right for them. None of which are toxic masculinity things, and so in that sense, I just wanted to re-emphasize that Oedipus is a name for something that doesn't capture the entirety of the name, of the thing. Yeah. So just getting close to the end here, I wanted to talk a little bit about what treatment is for Freud. There's a line, I can't actually remember where it was from, I'm sorry, I didn't do proper sourcing for this video, but Freud says at some point, the goal of psychoanalysis is to turn hysterical misery into everyday unhappiness, or maybe if we can turn it from hysterical misery into everyday unhappiness, I'll count it as a success, or something like that. He didn't think that you could solve all your problems, but he did think that you could solve a lot of them, or get more comfortable with them. And that was really the goal of psychoanalysis, was to deal with a lot of the problems that people create for themselves and just give them a more comfortable way of being in the world. And I think of analysis as basically a detective work. The analyst sits there, and there's this thing that Freud called the fundamental rule of psychoanalysis, which is that the patient should say exactly what comes into their head as soon as it comes into their head, without censoring it, even, or in fact especially, if they think it's irrelevant or if they think it's embarrassing. There should be no self-censorship, and this is free association. I think there's, again, a misconception of free association is actually something like word association. I say day, you say night. I say cat, you say dog. That's not free association. Free association is, what are you thinking about right now? It's more like stream of consciousness. It's just letting everything flow out in verbal form. And the idea is that this will give an opportunity for the unconscious of the patient to express itself. And then the analyst is sitting there like Columbo, just one thing. Now, you used that word heavy earlier. You also used that last time when you were talking about your father. And then the patient will start talking about what heavy means, or what heavy meant with their father. The analyst is there to pick up on words that are being used repeatedly, and notice when patients are unconsciously expressing themselves. There are these things, Lacan calls them the formations of the unconscious, the things that the unconscious produces, just symptoms, which we kind of talked about a bit earlier. Dreams, which I haven't talked much about dreams, but Freud thought that they were a fabulous way to get access to the unconscious. And again, there's a misconception about dreams and dream analysis that you say, oh yeah, well, that tree represented your penis, and the lamp represented your father, or whatever. Sorry, I'm just looking around the room and free associating. But it's, I think, more an opportunity to jumpstart that free association. You come in with a dream, you were free associating all night, you were producing these thoughts. And there's a lot written about dream analysis, and I'm pretty skeptical about some of the dream analysis that Freud does in his case studies. It's something that I personally have difficulty with, but I think there's truth in dreams are a time at which our unconscious is less constrained. Parts of our id let themselves run free a little bit. Lacan said that every dream in some sense is a nightmare. I think there's something really beautiful and cool in that thought. Anyway, sorry. So formations of the unconscious. Symptoms, dreams, jokes, and slips. Slips of the tongue and other bungled actions is one not very neat translation of the German word that Freud uses, which I can't remember right now. But these are, or parapraxes, again, just means like when you do something wrong. The idea is that when you do something wrong, on some level your unconscious is doing it deliberately. Maybe you leave your notebook at home when you're on your way to class. Maybe on some level that's your unconscious saying, I don't want to go to class. Because, what happens? I don't have my book. I have to go home. The symptom is, the outcome is what you really wanted. And your unconscious is letting you do what you really wanted. Or maybe you didn't want to pay attention in class, and so you're like, oh, well, can't take notes now. I guess I'll just, forget all this stuff. Again, I think, on some level, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Sometimes you just leave the book at home, and maybe a really hardcore Freudian would disagree about that. That everything that you do is deliberate from some part of yourself, some unconscious part. But anyway, that's a bit about bungled actions. But I just wanted to tell a joke about a slip of the tongue. One example I gave the other day was about if a patient says, "I'm just really angry. I mean, anxious." Probably they're really angry, but they don't want to let themselves be angry. So they've said that they're anxious instead, but part of their unconscious knows that they're angry and has just let a little bit out there. So that's a slip of the tongue, the classic Freudian slip. I just wanted to tell a classic joke. You've probably heard it before if you've thought about this stuff even slightly. It's not a very good joke, but there are these three guys having a drink, and they're all really unhappy. And the first one goes, "Oh, I did something so embarrassing the other day. I went to buy a ticket for a train, and it was a really attractive lady at the ticket booth. And I wanted to say, 'Can I get a ticket to Pittsburgh?' But it came out wrong. I said, 'Can I get a ticket to Titsburg?' And it was so embarrassing." And the second guy says, "Oh, you think that's bad? That's nothing. I was having breakfast with my wife the other day, and I meant to say, 'Would you pass me the butter, honey?' And instead I said, 'I want a divorce. You're ruining my life, you dumb bitch.' And the third guy says, 'You think that's bad? Well, I've got something much worse. I was up all night tossing and turning, thinking, gosh, I need to end my relationship. This woman's ruining my life. I can't do this anymore.' And I worked up the courage, and over breakfast I was about to say, 'I want a divorce. You're ruining my life, you dumb bitch.' And instead what came out was, 'Honey, could you pass me the butter?'" That is from Slavoj Žižek's joke book called "Have You Heard the One About Hegel and Negation?" Which is a great book, and I'd strongly recommend it. Anyway, it's just a little bit about slips. This is just a nice picture about people arguing, and they're Jews. I'm Jewish, FYI. So racists, feel free to slam me in the comments. But I just wanted to say all of this stuff is really difficult. There's a lot of different sides to it. We're never going to agree on how the mind works. It's not like the periodic table where we can measure atoms. It's not like engineering where we can figure out the exact amount of stress that a bridge can take. The mind is complicated. We can't see it. We're never going to be able to measure it properly. Neuroscientists might think that they can get to some truth of it, but and I'm sure that there's a lot of value in neuroscience. I'm not trying to poo-poo that. I'm just saying there's more to the psyche, there's more to people than what's going on in our brains. I've just presented one version of my understanding of Freud through a Lacanian lens. There's always going to be more. I'm going to change my mind about a lot of this stuff, I'm sure. A couple of years from now, I'm going to watch this video and be terribly embarrassed that that's what I said about the pleasure principle, or whatever. So feel free to disagree about this. Freud doesn't have to be right. You don't have to become a Freudian. I just felt like, as I said, he wasn't done justice in a class that I was in. So I've been wanting to make this video because I like arguing, just like the guys in this image. So thank you so much for watching the video. I'd love any feedback about it. I hope you will go to therapy.